They thought his silence was weakness, but when the dust settled, only one man was left standing, the man they never saw coming. The sun hung high and merciless, pouring down its heat on the little frontier town like a blacksmith's hammer on glowing iron. The main street shimmered in the haze, the boards of the saloon's porch creaking under the restless shifting of men, with nothing better to do than watch the day drag by. Dust whispered across the road in lazy swirls, clinging to boots, settling on hats, turning every color into the muted tones of the desert. Sheriff Samuel Kaine stood at the edge of his office porch, one hand resting on the worn rail, the other loosely hanging at his side. He was a man the town barely noticed until they needed him, tall but not imposing, with a frame that seemed built for leaning against walls rather than throwing punches. His hat-shaded eyes that told more stories than his mouth ever would, eyes the color of deep river water, dark and still, as if they'd been watching longer than the rest of the world had been alive. Inside the mercantile, old Mrs. Lyle peered through the dusty front window, her voice low as she whispered to the clerk. "Too gentle, that's what I say. Not a drop of fight in him. You watch, one of these days trouble's gonna come, and he'll stand there like a scarecrow while the rest of us get trampled." The clerk grunted his agreement, though his eyes flicked toward Kaine with something less certain. There was a quietness about the sheriff that didn't feel like fear, more like waiting. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, sharp and warning, before silence swallowed the sound. Then came the faint, rhythmic thud of hooves. At first they blended with the breeze, but soon the sound grew heavy, deliberate, the kind that carried dust and trouble behind it. From the north road, they appeared, 6 riders strung out in a loose line, their silhouettes blurred by heat shimmer until they drew closer and the dust lifted enough to see their faces. Clay Maddox led them, his grin wide and cruel beneath the brim of a black hat. A man who'd shot his way across 3 counties without ever losing that smile, as if each kill was just a new verse in a song only he could hear. His gang rode with the ease of men who had never been told no, their horses lathered from the run, their eyes scanning the storefronts with a predator's hunger. Kaine didn't move from the porch. He watched them come in slow, his expression unchanged, as if they were just another part of the weather. The townsfolk melted into doorways and behind curtains, the creak of hinges marking each vanishing face. A shop sign swung in the faint wind, its chain groaning, the sound strangely loud in the emptied street. Maddox's horse clattered to a halt in front of the sheriff's office. He tipped his hat in mock politeness, his grin deepening. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he drawled, the word carrying just enough mockery to make it sting. "Fine day for a little visit." Kaine's gaze lifted, slow as a shadow stretching toward sundown. "Afternoon." His voice was steady, almost mild, and it slid into the space between them like a stone into still water, small, but sending ripples all the same. Maddox laughed, glancing over his shoulder at his men as if to share the joke. "You hear that, boys? Man talks like he's setting out tea." The others chuckled, the sound dry and mean. One of them spit into the dust. Another tugged at the reins to make his horse sidestep closer to Kaine. The sheriff didn't flinch. He didn't shift his stance, didn't even put a hand near the colt at his hip. His eyes stayed on Maddox, calm as the deep center of a canyon where no wind reached. Over at the saloon, the batwing doors fluttered as a man backed inside, muttering something about keeping his head down. Through the gap, the dim interior swallowed him, the piano silent, the smell of whiskey and old wood pressing close. Maddox's grin thinned, just a touch. "Tell me, Sheriff, how's a quiet man like you keep order in a place like this? Folks say you don't much care for fighting." Kaine's answer came soft. "I keep the peace." The gang leader's laugh rang out, sharp as the crack of a whip. "Peace." He leaned forward in the saddle, his shadow falling long over the sheriff's boots. "Out here, peace belongs to the man who's willing to take it." The words hung in the air, daring Kaine to reach for his gun, but he didn't. He let them sit, let the wind carry them past him like grit in the air. Somewhere down the street, the church bell shifted in its frame, letting out a dull clunk. "Boys," Maddox said, straightening, "let's take a look around. See what's worth our time." He jerked his chin toward the saloon, and two of his men swung down, boots hitting the ground with solid thuds. They strolled toward the doors, shoving past a man who'd been trying to sneak out. Inside, the sound of chairs scraping and glass breaking followed almost immediately. Kaine's gaze tracked them for a moment, then settled back on Maddox. The outlaw studied him in return, the easy grin slipping into something sharper, like a knife tested against a thumb. He wasn't sure yet if the sheriff's stillness was just cowardice, or the kind of patience that gets men killed. From somewhere deep in the saloon came a crash, followed by a bark of rough laughter. Maddox didn't look away from Kaine when he said, "Guess we'll be in town a while. You got a problem with that, Sheriff?" Kaine's answer was a slow shake of the head. "Not unless you give me one." The gang leader's eyes narrowed, the heat between them tightening like a rope. For a heartbeat, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. The wind paused. The dog somewhere far off went silent, and the only sound left was the faint creak of leather as Maddox's fingers tapped against his thigh. Then he laughed again, loud and sudden, breaking the spell. "You're a strange one, Kaine. Real strange." He turned his horse with a jerk of the reins, riding toward the saloon, without looking back. His men followed, the thunder of hooves fading into the lazy chaos spilling from the building. Kaine stayed where he was, leaning against the porch rail once more. From the shadows, the townsfolk peered out, their eyes flicking between the sheriff and the noise at the saloon. They wanted to see something, anything, that proved he'd stand up to the outlaws. But Samuel Kaine just kept watching, his face unreadable, like a man studying the wind before a storm he already knew was coming. The heat pressed down, heavy as ever, but somewhere beneath it, the air felt different now. Charged, waiting, and though no one could see it, Kaine's hand drifted just a fraction closer to the worn grip of his Colt before settling back at his side, the motion so small it might have been nothing at all. The day rolled on, and the dust kept swirling, but the quiet in Samuel Kaine's eyes had deepened, and for the first time in a long while, it wasn't the quiet of a man with nothing to say. It was the quiet of a man who had decided, in his own time, to speak. Clay Maddox came back out of the saloon with the swagger of a man who thought the town was already his. The midday sun caught the brass buckles on his gun belt, throwing sharp glints into the eyes of anyone who dared to look too long. His men fanned out across the street, boots thudding against the boards, dust clinging to their coats, and hats like a second skin. They moved with the kind of lazy confidence that comes from knowing nobody will stop you. Two of them were laughing at some private joke, their mouths split in grins that didn't reach their eyes. Another flicked a spent match into the street, watching it land in the dust like he was setting the whole town alight. Maddox himself carried the air of someone who had long ago decided the world was his for the taking, and anyone who didn't agree could end up face down in the dirt. They didn't just walk, they owned every step. Passing the smithy, one of the gang tipped over a barrel of water just to watch the puddle steam away in the heat. Another scraped his spurs along the wall of the general store, gouging the wood as if marking territory. The shopkeepers kept their heads low, pretending to sweep floors or rearrange shelves while peeking from the corners of their eyes. The saloon was where they settled, pushing through the batwing doors in a wave of heat and noise. Inside, the barkeep, a thin man with a handlebar mustache, froze with a glass in hand. Maddox leaned across the bar, the leather of his coat creaking, and knocked the drink clean from the man's grip. "Ain't you gonna welcome us proper?" he said, his voice all teeth. The barkeep stammered, pouring whiskey with trembling hands. One of the outlaws grabbed a bottle without asking, took a long pull, and slammed it down so hard the counter jumped. Another shoved a card table aside, scattering chips and sending two men scrambling toward the door. Laughter rose from the gang, rough and sharp-edged, filling every corner of the room. Then the first gunshot cracked the air. It wasn't aimed at anyone, just fired into the ceiling. But the sound punched through the saloon, like a thrown brick through glass. Dust sifted down from the rafters, the echo bouncing down the street. A second shot followed, then a third, each one ringing louder than the last in the ears of those huddled outside. Samuel Kaine was still on the porch of his office when the gunfire started. His eyes shifted toward the saloon, but nothing else about him moved. To anyone watching, he looked almost bored, as if men firing pistols in the middle of town was just another sound of the day, no different from a wagon wheel creaking or a church bell tolling. The batwing doors burst open again, and Maddox stepped into the sunlight, rolling his shoulders like a man limbering up for sport. He spotted Kaine instantly, and his grin widened. "Sheriff," he called, loud enough for his voice to carry to every listening ear. "You awake over there?" Kaine's gaze lifted. "I'm awake." "Good," Maddox said, taking a few steps toward him, the spurs on his boots clicking like distant hammers. "Because I'd hate for you to miss the fun. Me and the boys are just stretching our legs. Thought we'd make ourselves at home." "You're standing in the middle of town," Kaine replied, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "That makes you my guest." The gang snickered at that, but there was no warmth in the sound. Maddox tilted his head, studying Kaine the way a cat studies a bird through a window, half curious, half cruel. "Guest, huh? That's mighty friendly. You gonna offer us supper next?" Kaine didn't answer right away. The pause seemed deliberate, the kind that stretched until the other man had to wonder who was really steering the conversation. "Depends," the sheriff said finally. "Guests behave themselves." The smile on Maddox's face faltered, then reappeared, sharper this time. He took a slow step closer. "And if they don't?" Kaine's eye stayed steady, unreadable. "Then they're not guests anymore." Something in Maddox's jaw tightened. He was used to men who stammered or blustered when he pressed them, not men who met him with calm so solid it was almost insulting. His fingers twitched near the butt of his revolver, not from fear, but from a need to remind the other man who carried the louder voice in a fight. The silence between them gathered weight. Folks leaning out from behind shutters found themselves holding their breath, without meaning to. The wind cut through the street, tossing a stray scrap of paper between the two men, like some unlucky messenger. Maddox broke first, not by drawing, but by laughing. It was a big, showy sound, meant for his men as much as for Kaine. "Hear that, boys? Sheriff says we gotta behave." His men roared with laughter, the noise rolling through the street like a train. "Guess we'll have to be real polite while we drink this place dry." With that, he turned his back on Kaine and headed for the saloon again. But before he reached the doors, he stopped and pivoted halfway, his eyes catching the sheriff's. "Course, I figure you and me'll get better acquainted real soon. Maybe later today." The grin that followed was slow and cold. Kaine didn't blink. "I'll be here." The gang disappeared inside again, the sound of boots on floorboards fading under the swell of voices and clinking bottles. A moment later, another shot fired into the air, this one followed by a cheer. From the shadowed porch of the barber's shop, a man muttered, "He's just gonna let him run wild." His neighbor shook his head, but his gaze lingered on Kaine, the same way you'd watch a poker player who hadn't touched his cards in half the game. Inside the saloon, the trouble only grew. Maddox was behind the bar now, pouring drinks for himself and knocking bottles to the floor for no reason at all. The barkeep's hands shook too much to stop him. A chair splintered against the wall. Glass crunched under boots. The smell of spilled whiskey thickened in the air. Maddox's voice rose above the din. "Tell me, fellas, how many of you think the sheriff's man enough to throw us out?" His men laughed and jeered, the sound spilling out into the street. Kaine heard it all, standing in the same spot he'd been for the past hour. If the taunts reached him, he gave no sign. His hand rested loosely on the rail, the sun carving deep shadows in the lines of his face. To an outsider, he might have looked beaten already. The quiet man in the wide had letting the town slide into the hands of the loudest voice. But the few who watched closely, really watched, saw something else. The set of his shoulders hadn't changed since the first hoofbeats entered town. The stillness wasn't slackness. It was a coiled, patient thing, like a rattler hidden under a rock, waiting for the right moment to strike. Back inside, Maddox leaned against the bar and called out toward the street, his voice cutting over the musicless air. "Kaine, I'm starting to think you ain't got the sand for this job. Maybe I ought to pin that badge on one of my boys. Least then it'd be on a man who knows how to use a gun." Kaine stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting the street without hurry. He took a few steps toward the saloon, just close enough for his voice to carry inside. "You're welcome to try." The gang went quiet for half a breath, then burst out laughing again, louder than before. But Maddox's eyes narrowed, and he watched Kaine turn and walk back to his porch without looking over his shoulder. Samuel Kaine pushed through the office door as if the hinges belonged to a quieter place. The room was small, 2 chairs, one desk scarred by years of elbows and spurs, a potbelly stove long gone cold, and it held the kind of hush that gathers around men who choose their words like they choose their battles. The deputy rose from the corner, hat in hand, young enough that his beard still came in uneven, voice too loud for the hour. "Sheriff, why didn't you act?" he asked, the question spilling out before the door had even clicked shut. "They're tearing up the saloon, firing into the ceiling, scaring folks half to death. You just stood there." Kaine set his hat on the peg and took his time with the dust on his sleeves. "They fired up," he said. "Not out. And the bar keeps alive." "That your measure now?" The deputy's jaw tightened. "We wait till they point at a person." Kaine considered the young man the way a surveyor measures distance, quietly, with the patience of a man who knows the ground will tell him what he needs if he keeps looking. "We wait till they believe they own the night," he said, "and then we show them who writes the morning." The deputy paced, boots whispering against grit. "Town thinks you're afraid." "Town's been wrong before," Kaine replied, not unkindly. He drew the chair back with a low scrape and sat, the wood groaning a little beneath him. The desk drawer slid open with a sigh. He took out a oiled cloth and a small bottle the color of dark honey. His revolver lay in the top right corner, where it always lay, worn smooth along the places his hands most often touched it. The deputy watched the gun like a man watching a door he wasn't sure he should open. "Folks are talking," he said, softer now. "Stories come up when men feel small. War stories, ghost stories. There's a name they whisper after the whiskey's gone to the back of the throat." Kaine pulled the cylinder, set it gently on a square of rag. Metal ticked softly on wood. "Names blow around," he said. "They say you had one." The deputy pressed, threading courage through his nerves. "Say you were a scout in the war who didn't miss. Say you walked out of Shiloh with mud to your knees and a stare that could find the one rifle on a hill. Say later you turned up out west, and 4 men challenged a stranger at sundown on a ridge of ironstone, and when the light was gone all 4 were quiet, and the stranger kept walking. They say that stranger disappeared. Then you showed up with a different name and a softer voice." Kaine ran the cloth along the barrel, every motion deliberate, respectful. A wheel squeaked out in the street, a tired horse shifted, and somewhere in the walls a fly rattled against glass. "They say a lot," he murmured. "You him?" the deputy asked, voice catching. "You the man from the ridge? The one they called Lantern, on account of how quick you moved when the light went? Or Ghost of Ash River? Or the draw from Perdition Bluff? Everybody's got a version." Kaine didn't look up. The cloth moved, the oil shined, and a thin thread of scent, metal and citrus and something like rain, uncoiled into the room. "They called men worse things than sheriff," he said. Outside, laughter burst and died, a flare of sound swept away by wind. The deputy flinched toward the door, but Kaine's stillness held him like a hand on the shoulder. The young man swallowed. "I don't understand your game." "It isn't a game," Kaine said. He turned the cylinder in his palm, the chambers winking, each one a small, waiting mouth. "It's a clock." The deputy frowned. "A clock. Every man keeps his own time," Kaine said. "Maddox measures in noise and daylight. He thinks day belongs to him, so he plays at owning it. But night changes a man's heart. The world shrinks to the size of his hands. He starts to wonder what he can hold and what he can't." He slid the cylinder back in place, with a click that seemed to settle the air. "That's when you speak to him." The deputy sank into the spare chair, as if his bones had been trading weight with the heat all afternoon. He ran a palm across his hair. "I just don't want anyone getting hurt." "That's why we'll do this clean," Kaine said. He wiped the grip last, thumb pressing into the old grooves, as if remembering the shape of a memory. The deputy's eyes drifted to the window, where the street held the afternoon in its fist, and squeezed, till it bled toward evening. He cleared his throat, then tried again, braver. "If you were that man, the one from the ridge, how'd it happen? How's a man walk away from for? Kaine's gaze slid past the young man and fixed on something the room didn't hold. Sun on stone. A low wind tasting of sage. The world pinched down to a coin of dying light. He didn't answer with words at first. The silence drew the picture just fine. A line in the dirt. Boots facing boots. Fingers settling, twitching still. A bird sang once and then thought better. Then the kind of silence that comes with the last inch of day, when every color deepens, and a man decides what he is. He set the revolver down and spoke as if to himself. You don't draw fast. You stop time. You let the world blink, and you don't blink with it. He leaned back, the chair sighing, and you walk away because your feet know the road before your head does. The deputy's breath left him like a door easing shut. For a heartbeat, he could see it. Sundown burning along the ridge like a fuse, for shapes tumbling, dust lifting, a figure stepping through the settling light without triumph or hurry. Then the picture was gone, tucked away wherever the sheriff put things he didn't intend to revisit. Folks'll keep guessing, the deputy said, voice barely above the floorboards. Let him, Kaine replied. A rumor's a shield, same as a wall. It keeps fools from testing the door. Evening came down in patient layers, washing the street in the color of bruised plums and cooling iron. Lamps blinked to life behind curtains. The seamstress on the corner lit her coal oil and turned the wick low. The church bell gave one tired note and fell quiet. Shadows melted across the porches till the town was a handful of eyes in the dark. Maddox's men took the night like a dare. They spilled out of the saloon with bottles swinging and boots loud. A crooked parade that headed straight for the mercantile. The first pane of glass cracked like thin ice. The second fell in bright teeth to the floor. Inside, shelves rattled, sacks split, and a pyramid of beans collapsed in a small avalanche that left the air smelling of tin and iron and dust. The clerk who'd been brave in whispers crouched behind the counter, heart tapping out its own loud language. Two outlaws crossed to the seamstress's shop. The younger of the pair, face too smooth for the stories he'd collected, jimmied the lock with a pocket knife, while his partner watched the church steps as if expecting a sermon. The door yielded. They prowled the place with the greed of boys in a pantry. A pin cushion rolled off a table and vanished into the dark. In the back room, a half-sewn dress sighed from its hook. Down the street, someone hammered at a private door. A woman gathered her child into her arms and stood perfectly still, as if stillness could turn the wood to stone. The man on the porch rattled the knob, laughed, and moved on when he met more lock than he wanted to explain to his leader. The laugh left a bruise in the air. The deputy rose halfway from his chair. Now, he said, but the word wasn't a question, it was an ache. The first light of dawn slid over the rooftops, washing the street in pale gold that made every shadow long and sharp. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't belong to peace but to exhaustion. Doors stayed shut. Curtains barely shifted. Somewhere a rooster crowed once, hesitant, as if even it knew the day wasn't safe to greet. The sound of wagon wheels broke the stillness, iron-rimmed and uneven, groaning under a weight they weren't meant to bear. Maddox sat high on the seat, reins loose in his hands, grinning as his gang trailed alongside. The wagon bed overflowed, bolts of cloth, sacks of flour, crates of canned goods, whiskey bottles clinking in the corners. Behind them, the mercantile's front window gaped open, glass glittering like spilled ice across the boards. They didn't ride fast. They owned the road, taking their time, letting the echo of their passage scrape at the nerves of anyone still willing to listen. Dust rose and hung in the air, softening the edges of the buildings until the whole town seemed to blur around them. In front of the general store, a young woman stepped out, clutching a basket against her hip. Her boy, no more than 6, trailed close, his hand hooked in her skirt. She froze when she saw the gang coming. Maddox spotted her at once. He tugged the reins, bringing the wagon to a halt, and 2 of his men swung down from their saddles. They moved in easy arcs, blocking her retreat without seeming to hurry. The woman pulled her son closer, the boy pressing his face into the fabric of her dress. "Well now," Maddox called, his voice carrying in the thin morning air. "Ain't you a sight worth stopping for?" He nodded toward the basket. "What you got there?" "Something for your friends." Her answer was a shake of the head, small and quick. One of the men stepped closer, shadow falling over her and the boy. His hand hovered just short of the basket's handle. From the far end of the street came a sound so small it almost didn't belong in the scene at all, the long, deliberate creak of a porch board. Maddox's grin stayed, but his eyes flicked past her. Samuel Kaine was walking down from his office porch, his boots whispering against the wood before they met the dust. He moved like a man neither rushed nor slow, every step exact. The early light caught the brim of his hat, leaving his face in shadow, but his eyes were clear enough. No longer the still pools of the day before, but sharp, cold, weighing everything in front of them. The gang shifted without thinking, the easy slouch gone from their shoulders. Maddox leaned back slightly, resting his elbows on the wagon seat. "Well now," he said again, but softer this time. "The quiet man comes to join us." Kaine didn't answer. The only sound between them was the faint hiss of wind moving along the street, rattling a loose sign above the blacksmith's. He stopped 10 paces from the wagon, his hands hanging at his sides, the worn grip of his cold brushing against his thigh. Maddox tilted his head, studying him. "You here to tell me about rules again, Sheriff?" Kaine's gaze didn't move from a woman and child. "Let them go." The words were flat, neither request nor threat. Maddox chuckled low in his throat. "You got a strange way about you. Always thought a man should try and talk himself bigger before he starts to dance." Kaine didn't reply. He took one slow step forward, boots crunching lightly in the dust. The man nearest the woman shifted back, without meaning to, his hand dropping from the basket. She seized the chance and edged toward the store's door. The boy pressed tight to her side. Maddox's smirk returned, though it had a crack in it now. "You think you can just walk up here and—" The wind rose, bending the tops of the mesquite beyond the edge of town. A shutter slammed somewhere behind them, the clap echoing like a signal. Kaine's eyes never left Maddox's face, and in them was nothing but arithmetic, distance, timing, the weight of a trigger pull measured against the weight of the air. No one spoke. Even the horses had gone still, ears flicking nervously. Maddox's hand hovered near his pistol, not quite touching, but the intent was there in the slow curl of his fingers. Kaine's remained loose, his stance unchanging, though every line of him was ready. The woman slipped inside the store, the door closing with a muted thud. Maddox's gaze darted after her for a heartbeat, then came back sharper. "Guess you want this your way." Kaine didn't blink. The street had narrowed to the space between them. The morning light climbed higher, gilding the dust that hung suspended between their boots. Somewhere far off, a coyote barked twice, then went silent again. Maddox gave a slow, deliberate smile, one that was all teeth and no mirth. "All right, Sheriff. Let's see what's underneath that quiet." Kaine's jaw tightened just enough to shift the line of his cheek. His eyes never moved from Maddox's, and the air between them seemed to hold its breath. The wind dropped, and the world listened. The street became a tunnel, its end sealed by heat and silence. The noise of the morning, the creak of leather, the shuffle of boots, the soft whicker of horses, thinned to nothing until only the space between Samuel Kaine and Clay Maddox existed. Dust curled lazily in the air, catching the low sun in thin gold strands. Each particle seemed suspended, waiting for permission to fall. Kaine's eyes were steady, fixed on Maddox as though the rest of the world had been erased. The outlaw's smirk lingered, but it was tighter now, the kind that clung more to pride than certainty. A bead of sweat traced a slow line from beneath his hat, catching in the stubble along his jaw. His fingers twitched, once, twice, hovering over the worn handle of his revolver. The sun pushed its way between them, bright enough to make both men squint. The light glared off the steel at Maddox's hip, throwing small, sharp flares into the dust. Somewhere, the wind shifted, rattling a loose shutter. It might as well have been a church bell calling time. Kaine didn't blink. He didn't breathe any quicker. His right hand hung loose, but the stillness of it was alive, coiled ready. He saw every detail, the way Maddox's knees flexed, the way the outlaw's hand shifted to find the grip, the faint tightening at the corner of his eyes. He saw it and weighed it against the morning light, the distance, the pulse of the moment. Maddox's fingers closed around his revolver's grip. Kaine moved. It was one motion, seamless. Hand to gun. Gun clear of the holster, the barrel finding its mark. The movement was too fast to follow. It didn't look like speed so much as the world slowing around him. Maddox's revolver was only halfway up when Kaine's first shot cracked the air. The sound slammed between the buildings, sharp enough to make a window pane hum. Maddox's gun spun from his hand as if wrenched by some invisible force, clattering into the dust a few feet away. He staggered, staring at his empty palm, the disbelief on his face brighter than pain. Kaine didn't lower his weapon. His eyes swept the line of outlaws flanking the wagon. They froze, caught between fight and flight. The second shot came, not at them, not to kill, but into the dust by the boot of the nearest man. The spray of grit was enough to send him stumbling back, hands raised. "Go," Kaine said, his voice flat, carrying just enough to reach them all. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man nearest the horses turned, vaulting into the saddle. Another followed, then another, until the whole gang was scattering down the street, spurs flashing, dust boiling up in their wake. Maddox stayed rooted, jaw tight, eyes locked on Kaine. But whatever was in that look, anger, humiliation, a hint of something like respect, he turned it away with a sharp breath and followed his men, one hand pressed to the shaking of the other. Kaine's gun stayed raised until the last echo of hooves had faded into the open land. Only then did he lower it, spinning the cylinder once before easing the weapon back into its holster. His movements were deliberate, calm, as if the shot he'd just fired was nothing more than a note in a song he'd played 100 times. The town stayed still for a heartbeat longer, caught in the aftershock. Then doors creaked open. Faces appeared at windows. A man stepped from the saloon, wiping his hands on an apron as though he'd been in the middle of work. Mrs. Lyle emerged from the mercantile side door, clutching her shawl tight, but craning for a better view. Kaine turned his head toward the general store. The young mother stood there with her son pressed against her, both of them staring at him as though he were something pulled from an old story. He tipped his hat once, a gesture that was more acknowledgement than reassurance, then stepped back toward his porch. The street began to breathe again. Boots shuffled, voices murmured. The blacksmith leaned on his doorway, shaking his head as if trying to reconcile the quiet man he'd known with the one who'd just sent a gang fleeing. Somewhere down the street, a child whispered, "Fastest I ever saw." And the words seemed to hang there, gathering weight. Kaine didn't linger in the center of attention. He crossed the porch, mounted the steps, and leaned once more against the rail, his eyes scanning the street with the same calm he'd held at dawn. But there was something different now, not in him, but in the way the town looked back. They didn't see the quiet sheriff anymore. They saw the man who could end a fight before the other side even knew it had begun. The man whose silence wasn't weakness, but warning. Kaine let the wind sweep the last of the dust from his boots. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the chill. Somewhere beyond the edge of town, the hoofbeats of the fleeing gang faded into nothing, leaving only the memory of the moment when the street had belonged to two men, and one had proven faster than time itself. Kaine slid the Colt into its holster with the same calm he'd had when drawing it, the leather swallowing the steel in a quiet, final sound. He didn't glance at the dispersing dust, didn't watch the horizon where Maddox and his gang had vanished. Instead, he turned and walked toward his office porch, boots pressing faint prints into the thin coat of grit on the street. The world seemed to part for him without effort. No one stepped in his way. No one dared to fill the space he left behind. Whispers followed him, trailing in the wake of his shadow. Some voices carried awe, low and reverent, like the first notes of a hymn. Others carried unease, as though what they'd just seen didn't sit right in the hands of any man, lawman or not. "Fastest draw in the West," someone murmured. Another voice answered, "Thought he was just a quiet one." The words moved from mouth to mouth, already slipping into the tone of something older than the moment itself, as though the story had been living here long before Kaine stepped into the dust. Mrs. Lyle stood by the mercantile door, clutching her shawl against her chest. Her lips moved soundlessly, maybe in prayer, maybe in disbelief. The blacksmith, arms still folded, gave the smallest of nods when Kaine passed. He hadn't cheered, hadn't spoken, but his eyes said enough. Respect earned in the plainest currency a man can offer, seeing and remembering. A boy, no more than 8, ran up to the edge of the porch, looking up at the sheriff with a face full of questions he didn't know how to ask. "Sheriff," he finally blurted, "you gonna stay here forever?" Kaine paused with one boot on the step. For a moment he looked at the boy, as if weighing the truth against what the boy might be ready to hear. Then he gave a faint smile, barely there, the kind that rose and fell in the same breath. "Forever's a long ride," he said, and went inside. The rest of the day passed in a quiet that felt both heavier and lighter. The gang was gone, but the air still carried their shadow, like smoke that lingers after the fire's been put out. Folks went about their business, repairing what had been broken, sweeping glass into piles, righting chairs in the saloon. But the street never shook off the feeling that it had been measured and found wanting, then saved by the least expected man in town. By evening, the sky had begun its slow burn toward night, painting the edges of the clouds in deep orange and molten gold. Kaine stepped out of the office, his hat low, saddlebag slung over one shoulder. The deputy met him there, frowning. "You're leaving?" Kaine nodded once. "Town's quiet now." The deputy shifted, clearly wanting to ask more, maybe even to ask him to stay. But the words tangled and died in his throat. He just nodded back, though his gaze followed Kaine to the hitching post. Kaine untied his horse with the ease of a man who'd done it 1,000 times, without thinking. He swung into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. For a moment he sat there, looking down the length of the main street, the saloon with its patched windows, the mercantile's new lock glinting in the fading light, the folks lingering in doorways to watch him without making it obvious. He touched the brim of his hat to no one in particular, a gesture that somehow included everyone. Then he turned the horse toward the west. The sun was dropping low now, a fiery disk melting into the horizon, throwing long shadows that reached ahead of him as if trying to pull him back. The hooves struck a slow, steady rhythm on the hard-packed dirt. With each step, the town grew smaller behind him, swallowed by distance and the thickening twilight. The last sounds, footsteps, a door closing, the call of a far-off bird, faded until all that was left was the creak of saddle leather and the wind in his ears. The street would remember him. The dust would, too. Long after the boards were replaced and the glass swept away, the tale would be told again and again. The day the outlaws laughed at the quiet sheriff, and seconds later, found themselves staring at the ground with empty hands. Some would tell it with pride, some with unease, but all would agree on one thing. When Samuel Kaine drew, he drew faster than the sun could blink. And so he rode on, without thanks, without celebration. Not because they weren't offered, but because he didn't need them. The road ahead was just another stretch of silence to be kept, another corner of the West where trouble thought it could breathe freely. Back in town, the wind picked up, swirling the last of the day's dust into the street. It drifted in slow spirals, curling past the saloon steps, over the wagon ruts, across the worn boards of the sheriff's empty porch. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the street grew still again, holding on to the echo of the morning when the laughter died, and silence claimed its place.